And let's bring our first storyteller, Ted Oz.
In 1922, my grandfather, Eladio Cricelli, he left Colonia. It's a tiny town in Calabria. He came to Detroit and he got a job at Ford Motors Foundry. It's big blast furnaces. In Italy, he'd been a shepherd. He worked under the sun. Stepping into that foundry had to seem a bit like going into hell each day. It took him 6 years to save enough to send for my grandmother Caterina and their now 7-year-old son, my uncle Nicola. They had 4 more kids. The youngest, Nunziata, that's my mom. The kids grew up speaking Italian as their first language, but they each married Americans. So my generation, none of us speak the language. We know nothing of being Italian, certainly nothing of being Calabrese. We were, from day one, typical Midwesterners. My grandparents never went back, and they died young. I never knew them. And because of that, we had no contact with relatives, but I was always curious. And I knew my grandmother had 2 sisters, and one had moved to Australia with her family, and the other had moved to Milan in the north with hers. A couple of years ago on Facebook, I found one of the Australian cousins, and he told me every summer, the Australians and the Northerners, they go back to Colonia for the entire month of August. Italians know how to vacation. He invited me to stay there, and you have to stay with somebody. There are no hotels, it's a tiny, tiny little town. And a couple of years ago, I went for a week. I'm a Midwesterner. I don't take a month-long vacation, you know. But it was magical. The town is from 500 BC. It's on a mountain 3 miles from the sea. And every morning, everyone goes to the main square. There's a cafe. You have espresso. Then you go to the beach. After lunch, take a nap. After dinner, everyone comes back to the square. The cafe's now a bar. You drink wine and talk shit all night long. It was the most stress-free, comfortable, and predictable life I could imagine. I mean, I loved it. And the thing is, everyone's there every second of every day because no one's got a job. I mean, Calabria is the poorest part of Italy. That's why my grandparents left. And it was perfect except for one thing. I'm as closely related to the Australians and the Northerners as they are to each other, but they had grown up seeing each other every summer. They went to each other's weddings, their family. I was a novelty. I mean, I won't be going to their weddings. And I was jealous of that misconnection. And I hate to say it, but I blamed my grandparents a little bit because if they had taken their kids back to Italy, maybe my mom would have taken me to Italy a few times, and then I could have been part of it. But the main thing I came away with was just a sense of awe about my grandparents. My cousin went to City Hall and he found their old address, and we went to see the place. And it's a tiny home built into a wall of other tiny homes, and it's been wrecked by squatters, but the porch was intact. And I was standing on the porch looking out at the sea, and I just realized all of this stuff. I mean, number one, if I had been born in that town, I would have died in that town. There's no way I would have had the courage to leave such a predictable, comfortable place. And, you know, it's one thing to sit in your living room here and say, my grandparents took a boat here from Italy. It's like, yeah, I took the L here tonight. I had to stand up pretty much the whole damn way. It's a whole nother thing to walk the streets they walk and to really know what it means to make that decision. I mean, you can't know until you've done that. For them to cross an ocean to a land where they knew nobody and they didn't speak the language, they had to be incredibly brave. They had to be so driven to get here and bust their asses to make a better life for themselves and their kids and their grandkids. And I realized that at that moment. And it strikes me that that's exactly what this country needed at the time, and we could use more of it today. And it strikes me that those qualities are probably far more accurate stereotypes of most immigrants than a lot of the hate that gets thrown around lately. Off my soapbox. And when I came back, I was no longer a typical Midwesterner. I'm half Calabrese. I'm a Dago, face it. And I am so proud of my grandparents. A couple months ago, I was in New York, and I went to a place called the Tenement Museum. It's an old apartment building that had housed wave after wave of immigrants, and they've redone several of the apartments as they might have looked at different periods of time. And the tour takes you to one that had housed an Italian family. And the guide told us the husband had come here in 1922 from Sicily. In 1928, he sent for his wife, but there was a problem. In 1924, Congress had passed a law limiting immigrants from Italy to 3,000 a year. It had been hundreds of thousands. They didn't limit the whiter Northern Europeans, the Germans, the British. But see, Italians, we're dirty people. And we're prone to crime. And we're swarthy. And we're lazy. And if we get a job, it's going to be taken from an American. And that's all in the congressional record, by the way. So they had to do it. They had to. They didn't really have a choice. And that couple were poor. There's no way this woman was going to get one of 3,000 spots. So she got in the country somehow, but she was without papers, which is where the slur WAP comes from. And because of that, she was never able to go back to Italy. She couldn't risk that she could get back in the States. And it was one of the heartbreaks of her life. And in that moment, I thought, everyone else in this tour is looking at their phone, trying to figure out where to go for lunch. But I felt like I got hit in the head with a shovel. I had never heard of that law. My grandma came here in 1928, and they were dirt poor. My grandma and my uncle had to have been here without papers, and that's why they never went back to Italy. Fear of the different in the 1920s reaches forward to today to screw up my relationship with my extended family. And that's nothing compared to the fear that immigrants face today. I know that. But its real damage flows directly from that law and can never be fixed, even when the law went away. That law, by the way, was on the books until the mid-1960s. I was born into a country that had that anti-Italian law. When I hear someone hate on immigrants today, I always ask them, do you have a drop of Italian blood in you? Because if their families are new to the country, they're not going to hate on immigrants. And if their families have been here for a little bit, they probably got some Italian in them because, let's face it, we're the sexiest people there are. And then I tell them about that law, and I tell them, I'm the proud half-Calabrese grandson of Caterina Corcelli, a woman the hater would likely have called illegal. Then I tell them about my Uncle Nick. He wasn't yet a citizen, but he joined the army. He hit Omaha Beach on D-Day, fought his way across France, and came back with a fistful of medals. That was the 7-year-old boy America didn't want. We should not be repeating this bullshit. Thank you.